Now here back in the auth service, earlier I told you that here in the constructor, we're subscribing to the authenticated event of the lock object. And this event is fired when the user successfully logs in. At this point, we log this auth result object in the console and store the token in the local storage. So let's have a closer look at what is happening under the hood. So once again, I'm going to log in with the same user. All right, now let's go to the console. So this is our auth result object. Note the properties here. We have an access token, which is a short string. We have ID token, which is our JSON web token. This is a very long string. We have ID token payload with these properties. Odd, which is short for audience, and that represents the party this token is for. In this case, this is the identifier of our Vega client application that we created in Auth0. So the token that we got here is valid for this audience. We have the expiry of this token, which is by default 10 hours, but you can change this in the settings for your client app in Auth0. We have the issuer, which is of course our Vega project.auth0.com, and sub, which is the user ID. So here my user ID has two parts. The first part is Auth0, and the second part is a unique identifier in Auth0. Now if I logged in via Google, the first part would be Google, and the second part would be some other identifier. Now let me show you something. I'm going to copy this ID token. So the entire string is copied, including double quotes. Now back in jwt.io, I'm going to paste this token here. And now let's decode it. Look at the payload. These are the properties that I was just talking about. Now we want to use this token to call our APIs. So we need to make a modification in this token and add the logical identifier of our API in the audience property. So just to refresh your memory, here in Auth0, in the API section, we created this API, Vega API, and we gave it a logical identifier. Now we want to add this identifier in our JSON web token. So this token can be used to make calls to this API. And by the way, as I explained before, this is just a logical identifier. This does not mean that you should have an endpoint accessible on the internet at this address. We need this identifier, so when we call our API, our JWT middleware is going to kick in, and then it's going to look at this token and see if this token is valid for our API endpoint or not. So how do we add this identifier as the audience? Well, let's go back to our hosted pages. Back in our JavaScript code for the creation of the lock object. Okay, here's where we create the lock object. So look at this params property. I'm going to change its value and initialize it like this. So an object with the property audience. And the value of this is going to be HTTPS. All right, now let's save the changes. Back in the application, I'm going to log out and log in again to get a new token. All right, now that we set the audience, the first time the user is trying to log in, they get this dialog, which is called the consent dialog. So this dialog is asking the user, is Vega app is allowed to access their data? This is similar to the dialog where you want to log in into a website, and then it redirects you to Facebook, and Facebook says that website needs to access a part of your information. However, in this particular case, it doesn't quite make sense because the user is still in the same application. They're not going anywhere else. So if the client of this application is running in my browser, I should be able to make calls to the backend of the same application. Now, this is something that Auth0 is currently working on. They're going to give you a setting to disable this consent dialog, and I would add a link to that later at the end of this section. So for now, let's just go ahead with this. Now, if you look at the console, you see an error. I'm going to get back to this shortly, but let's inspect this auth result object. Note that now access token is a long string, and this is our JSON web token. Previously, before we set the audience, access token was a short temporary string. Now it's the actual JSON web token. Also, we no longer have the ID token and ID token payload properties. They're undefined. So this is what happens. When we set the audience property in our lock object, Auth0 behaves in a slightly different way. They call this OIDC or OpenID Connect compliant mode. So OpenID Connect is an authentication protocol that defines a set of standards for implementing single sign-on authentication across multiple websites. Auth0 embraces OpenID Connect, so when you set the audience property, it behaves a little bit differently. So instead of ID token, it returns an access token that is compliant with OpenID Connect. Now, this is going to get more clear to you as we go through this section. So don't worry about all this new terminology. Now, let's take a look at this exception. This exception happens because in our auth service, we want to store this ID token in the local storage. So as you saw, ID token is undefined. So we store this undefined token in the local storage. And later in our nav menu, where we call the authenticated method, this method, as you see, is using this token not expired function. So this helper function is going to get our token from our local storage, decode it, and see if it's expired or not. Now, obviously, we stored undefined there, so that's why we got this exception. Now, here in the constructor, we need to change this line to auth result.access token. Save. Now, back in the application, refresh. We get an unexpected error, and it's exactly for the same reason. Because in our nav menu, we want to see if the user is authenticated or not, but the token we have stored in the local storage is undefined. So the workaround that is to manually delete this token and then log in again. So back in Chrome Developer Tools, we go to the Application tab. So here we have the local storage, and this is the local storage for this application, localhost port 5000. Now this is our token, and you can see it's undefined. So I'm going to delete this. Now back here, refresh. Okay, beautiful, no more errors. Let's log in again. Everything working beautifully. Let's have a look at our local storage one more time. So here's our token. I'm going to copy this value back to JSON Web Token Debugger. I'm going to paste it here. And now let's decode it. Now look at the audience. We have two values here. One is api.vega.com, so we can use this token to call our own API. And the other is vegaproject.auth0.com/userinfo. So this is an endpoint on Auth0. We can use the same token to make a call to this endpoint and get the user's profile. And that's what I'm going to show you in the next lecture.